Okay. Okay, what's up, everybody? So, today, we're going to be talking about the resurrection of Christ, which is pretty cool because, Easter season, well, we're really at Easter season. Easter is approaching. I think it's about 2 weeks away this year. So, uh, that's kind of, if you don't believe in coincidences, well, um, talking about the resurrection around the Easter time, around Easter time. But that's what we're talking about today. And I'm not sure if most Christians, at least maybe not, maybe in America, maybe understand really how important the resurrection is to our faith. Um, this is not one of the things that can really be negotiated as far as Christianity is concerned. Like, there's a lot of beliefs that Christians hold that Christians disagree with, about kind of like, I think a lot of them has to do with like the end times. Many Christians disagree on what the end times kind of look like, or if it even really is a relevant area of study. I think it is, but some say, nah, kind of just don't need to worry about it. Um, and then if you do think it's an area of study that you need to get into, there's like at the least, three major views. They all have their pros and their cons. I'm a what you call a premillennial, but there's people that are amillennial, and there's people that are postmillennial, which that view seems to be on the rise these days. The postmillennial view. Um, so different views about these things. But the core thing is what unites premillennials, amillennials, and postmillennials. What unites them is that there will be a physical resurrection of everybody at some point, that Jesus Christ really is coming back, and he will judge the world, and there will be a new heaven and new earth. So everybody agrees on that point. Just kind of how all of that's going to work, that's kind of where the disagreement lies. Um, but with the resurrection, this is different. This is absolutely central. In other words, if you deny the resurrection, you're not a Christian. I just put it that way. If you say that Jesus never rose from the dead, you're not a Christian. Um, and I think we can see this in the New Testament. I think I can back that up with the New Testament. Um, because the Apostle Paul, he really appeals to the resurrection as really the central claim of Christianity. According to Paul, if Jesus was not resurrected, then the Christian faith is really just a waste of time. And I've read this passage before, but I want to read it again because it's so central. So it's 1 Corinthians 15:12 through 19. It says, "Now if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our proclamations is in vain, and so is your faith. Moreover, we are found to be false witnesses about God, because we have testified wrongly about God that he raised up Christ, whom he did not raise up, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless, you are still in your sins. Those then who have fallen asleep in Christ have also perished. If we have put our hope in Christ for this life only, we should be pitied more than anyone." So basically, that's Paul's point there, is like, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, everything that Christians are doing is ultimately pointless. The reason the resurrection is important is because it validates the teachings of Jesus, not only who he was, but what he said. because Jesus's, or I guess I should have said that backwards, because Jesus's teachings were not just, ethics and morals and just good rules to live by, but rather a good portion of his teaching was about who he was. So at stake here is the ability to know who Jesus was, thus how we should respond to him. So I think I've already demonstrated in past videos that miracles and prophecy, that those are not things that can just be dismissed out of hand, and the resurrection is certainly miraculous, but it was also prophesied, and Jesus specifically prophesied it. But then here I'm going to talk about. We'll go through what resurrection is in a second, but I want to just lay out sort of what's going to sort of be the framework for today. So we're going to look at the resurrection and what that actually is, and should be understood as. But I also want to think about that. Are there any other options? And we're going to look at 9 different options to determine if the resurrection is the most likely. So there's the swoon theory, the twin theory, the stolen body theory, the hallucination theory, the wrong tomb theory, the alien theory. You may have not heard that one, but that exists. The legend theory, the account of the resurrection in the Quran, and then of course the biblical account. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what the resurrection is actually meant to be understood as, and we'll see what facts the theories need to account for. So, what is a resurrection in the first place? So, what are we actually looking for and looking at? Well, resurrection is not a resuscitation. And what that means, that it's not a body that's brought back to its former life. In other words, a body that needs food or gets sick or will age or will die again. So you can think about this like when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. That technically was not what you would call biblically a resurrection. He was resuscitated. Because in a resurrected state is a body that it's physical, but it's incorruptible. So it cannot die, it cannot age, it cannot get ill. And this is the body that the Pharisees were teaching that would appear to righteous Jews at the end times. So N.T. Wright says, quote, "The present state of those who had died would be replaced by a future state in which they would be alive once more." So that's the idea of resurrection. So if we look at the story of the resurrection and we just get down to just the facts, the Gospels record that Jesus was crucified. He died on the cross, and he was buried in the tomb. 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and his followers said that they saw his physical body risen from the dead over a period of 40 days. Now, non-Christian sources agree with at least some of these claims. Josephus mentions Jesus' crucifixion. Pliny the Younger records Christians that they meet on a fixed day to worship Jesus, which was probably Sunday, if we're reading the Church Fathers correctly. The Talmud, which is a book of Jewish oral tradition and commentary from the 2nd century A.D. and on, mentions Jesus' crucifixion as well. There's also an anti-Christian Jewish document called the Toledos Jesu, which tells of a plot by Jesus' disciples to steal the body of Jesus. And this was supposed to explain why the tomb was empty. Gary Habermas says about this, he says, quote, It is true that the Toledo Jesu was not compiled until the 5th century AD, although it does reflect early Jewish tradition. Even though Jewish scholars scorned the reliability of this source, the teaching that the disciples were the ones who removed the dead body of Jesus persisted in the early centuries after Jesus' death. So basically, it's just saying that it was a common belief among the Jews that that's what had happened, that the disciples had stolen the body, and that's the idea that persisted. Now, all of these events, they have to be accounted for by the various theories to make sense of Jesus' death and the events of the following Sunday. So we're going to look at each theory and look at their explanatory power. Can they cover everything that I've mentioned, which was Jesus was crucified, he died on the cross, buried in the tomb empty 3 days later. His disciples started to say that they saw him alive over a period of 40 days. So we're going to look at that. So first up, we're going to look at the swoon theory, which is the idea that Jesus just fainted on the cross and he just appeared to be dead. It wasn't really dead. And Jesus was put in the tomb, and he awoke and he recuperated in the damp coolness of the tomb, and he recovered. But to really appreciate this argument, I think we have to understand what was really involved in the torture that preceded the crucifixion as well as the crucifixion itself. So, before being crucified, Pilate ordered Jesus to be scourged, or scourged, may be how you pronounce it. But a Roman scourging was done with a whip that was called a flagrum, or also called a flagellum, which was comprised of a handle about 8 inches long with 12-inch to 24-inch long leather straps attached to the end. At the other end of the straps, there were tied these lead balls to them, as well as sharp pieces of metal, bone shards, broken glass, or sharp rock. But whatever was at the end of the whip would quickly break into the skin, which would allow the flagrum to deeply penetrate tissue and pull away flesh, which would actually often expose, organs and the ribs and the spine and stuff like that. Eusebius in the 4th century preserves a description from a 2nd century scourging. He says, quote, "Those standing around were struck with amazement at seeing them lacerated with scourges to their very blood and arteries, so that no flesh concealed in the very inmost parts of the body, and the bowels themselves were exposed to view." So, as you can probably tell from that quote, that the scourging was so bad that some actually didn't even survive it. Victims lost so much blood that they went into what's called hypovolemic shock, which was basically that the heart would speed up to compensate for the blood loss. The blood pressure would drop, which would make the victim either faint or collapse. The kidneys would shut down to keep as much blood volume as possible. And because the body needs fluid so badly to replace the lost blood, the victim would become extremely thirsty. Jesus' crucifixion followed, the beating aside. In the crucifixion, the victim was laid down with his arms perpendicular to the torso, so kind of stretched out like this. And the nails, which were typically 5 to 9 inches long, would be driven through both wrists, so kind of in this area. And this would crush the median nerve, which is the largest nerve going to the hand. And this would cause an extraordinary amount of pain. Nails would then be driven near the ankles with the legs in a bent position. So oftentimes you kind of see with the feet kind of on top of each other, but most of the research I've done indicated that they actually would have gone, and I'm not going to get up and show you, but you have that tendon in the back of like your heel. It would have been between your ankle and the what's it called, Achilles tendon, I believe. So that was more likely the place where the nail was put. But then the victim was raised to a vertical position, and his shoulders, as well as sometimes the elbows and wrists, would dislocate from the weight pulling, which would make them useless to alleviate the pressure on the chest. And so at this point, the nailing of the wrist kept the position of the body so the pressure of the chest was relentless and kept the victim from flopping forward. So the victim could not exhale. And so to lessen the pressure, the victim would straighten his legs using the nails in his ankles. And then having exhaled, the victim would sink back down to his original position. So they would have to push up to exhale, and then they would kind of slouch back down. And the wood from the cross was very rough, which would make the sliding, up and down on the back very painful. And as the victim's strength was worn down slowly, breathing would become less frequent, which would increase the acidity in the blood. And this would cause an irregular heartbeat that was already pretty rapid because of the hypovolemic shock. And this would cause fluid to build up in the membranes around the heart and lungs. And death would come from either asphyxiation or heart failure, either one. And it could possibly take days for you to die. But if the executioner wanted to speed up the process, he would break the legs of the crucified victim with a club, and then at that point, death would come within minutes. Now, in the case of Jesus, the executioner was going to break his legs, but Jesus already appeared dead. But to make sure, the executioner took a spear and thrust it into Jesus' side, which would pierce his heart and lung. So if Jesus had not already died from the crucifixion itself, he would have from the spear wound. And there was no question in the mind of the professional killer that Jesus was dead. So with this in mind, let's return back to the swoon theory. So for the swoon theory to be true, Jesus would not only have to have survived the piercing in his heart and his lung, but he also would have had to control how much blood flowed out of the wound by willpower, I guess. Because if the wound bled too much, it would have betrayed a beating heart. And that would have led to the breaking of his legs and then him dying then. So thus the executioner was fooled by Jesus, his act, and then he was buried in the tomb. And after 36 hours, Jesus had sufficiently recovered from his wounds to rise, to walk. So getting up on his feet that had just been impaled, Jesus then would have had to pop his shoulders back in place, and possibly his arms and wrists as well. Jesus then would have had to roll away an extremely heavy stone. Okay? And after exiting, he would have to overpower a number of Roman guards using no weapons. Then Jesus, who would have been recognized, walked unrecognized and unnoticed through Jerusalem in broad daylight, not clothed properly, with strips of flesh hanging from his body, exposing his bowels and bones, and proceeded 7 miles down the road to Emmaus. After the evening meal, he would then return to Jerusalem, discover where the apostles were, where they were hiding. He would have had to have broken into a locked room, leaving no clue of how he got in. Having gotten into the room, Jesus presented himself as risen from the dead and convinced his followers that despite the fact like he looked like someone who fell into a meat grinder and needed immediate, intense medical and prolonged medical attention, then he performed the illusion of vanishing into thin air. Okay? That's what you got to believe if you believe the swoon theory. Now, this may account for an empty tomb, granted, but it doesn't account for anything else. In fact, I would say it raises more questions, given that that would be a colossal fraud committed by Jesus to accommodate the swoon theory, and that's completely contradictory to everything we know about Jesus' character and teaching. I really think the foolishness of the swoon theory is really self-evident. So, yeah, pretty stupid to believe that. Then there's the twin theory, and this one's pretty wild too. It's the idea that Jesus had an identical twin brother that nobody knew about who took Jesus' place on the cross. And as with the swoon theory, I think a major weakness in this theory is that Jesus would have behaved contrary to his teachings to make this fraud a success. So in order for this to work, Jesus would have somehow, convinced or coerced the twin to spend his life in hiding and to die for Jesus' own ego, which would be a plan of deceit and manipulation. So, in fact, if this is true, not only is Jesus not worthy of worship, but he should have been punished if he does something crazy like that. But another problem with this theory is that there's no reason to believe it, because there's no evidence for it. The facts about Jesus' family mention brothers and sisters, but there's no mention of a twin. Luke, who received information about Jesus' birth from Mary, makes no mention of a twin. So considering Jesus was Mary's first pregnancy, it would have been very odd to leave that out, I think. But even more preposterous for this to work, Mary would not have recognized the difference between her own sons. Now, Mary was at the foot of the cross and had apparently a very close view of the man hanging there because the person on the cross was able to speak to her. And there's no reason to believe that she thought it was Jesus' twin or something like that. Another problem with this view is that it doesn't explain the empty tomb. If Jesus' twin was executed, then what happened to his body? If a contemporary of Jesus wanted to shut up the early Christians and discount the claims that Jesus rose from the dead, they had to do one or two things. They had to produce the body or prove the body was stolen. The fact that the body was not produced in an empty tomb is traditionally attested by both Christians and the antagonist to Christianity is pretty powerful. So the possibility of the body being stolen is going to be, I'm going to deal with that next. But there's no reason to hold the twin theory, I don't think. So the stolen body theory is the idea that Jesus' followers stole his body from the tomb. Now, this theory has an advantage over the other one, and it's because it actually dates back to the 1st century, which was the time it took place. And it's actually recorded in the Bible in Matthew 28:11-15, as well as in Jewish tradition as well. Now, the weakness of this is that it does not take into account the behavior of the disciples. So, even though Jesus spoke of his death and resurrection to them, the disciples did not expect that Jesus would actually physically rise from the dead 3 days later. So his appearance, that was news to them. So, because the picture of Jesus' disciples after his arrest is not very flattering. The Gospels record that when Jesus was arrested, all of the disciples deserted him, despite their pledge that they wouldn't earlier, Peter, who's kind of seen as the leader of them, denied he knew Jesus 3 times. The Sunday morning after the crucifixion, Mary returns from the tomb to discover the disciples weeping and mourning. And of course, they refuse to believe her that he's alive. Sunday evening, the disciples are described as having the doors locked, hiding because they feared the Jews. And when Jesus appeared, they were terrified. They were not excited. But 50 days later, when the apostles are preaching publicly and they're performing miracles in Jerusalem, and Peter, rather than denying him, is boldly preaching the resurrection of Jesus. So it seems odd that if they stole the body, they would then, in a matter of weeks, turn around and proclaim the resurrection of Jesus so unabashedly and with passion and commitment. In fact, their passion grew and they became more emboldened as their lives unfolded. So they were so committed to the resurrection of Jesus that most likely all of the disciples except John paid for that claim with their lives. So James, the brother of John, was beheaded in Jerusalem by Herod around AD 44. That's actually in the Bible. Philip was scourged and crucified in Hierapolis, Greece, AD 54. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross in Greece around AD 60. Matthew was pinned to the ground and beheaded in Ethiopia around AD 60. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome around AD 64. Thomas was executed with spears in India around AD 70. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, was flayed alive in Armenia. Matthias, Judas Iscariot's replacement, was stoned and beheaded in Jerusalem. Judas, also known as Thaddeus, was crucified in Edessa, Greece, around AD 72. And Simon the Zealot was martyred in Persia. Now, most biblical references have no information on the death of James, son of Alphaeus. Now, some references believe he's the same person as James, the brother of Jesus, but the evidence is actually against that position. But according to tradition, James, the brother of Jesus, was thrown from the temple tower in Jerusalem and was beaten until he died. Now, I'll admit that some of these sources for this information come pretty late, and sometimes there are competing traditions regarding the method, the time, and or the place of the martyrdom. However, there are no competing traditions that contend that any of the apostles, apart from John, died of natural causes. Only different forms of martyrdom. And some of them we actually are pretty sure of what happened to him. Like, I didn't mention Paul on here, but we're pretty sure we know what happened to Paul. Pretty sure we know what happened to Peter. We obviously know what happened to James, brother of John. Pretty sure we know what happened to James, brother of Jesus. And Andrew, Thomas, and Philip were, I would say somewhat sure. Now, yeah, some of them not quite sure. But anyway, the point is that these men scattered the known world for the reasons of proclaiming the physical, historical resurrection of Jesus. So for this stolen body theory to be true, we would have to believe that 11 non-military men overpowered a number of Roman soldiers guarding the tomb, disposed of the body, and then fabricated a story that they all fanatically stuck to, even as they were being, crucified, stoned, scourged, beheaded, thrown from buildings, and skinned alive. So the lives of the apostles, they don't show any motive for stealing the body or perpetuating the lie of Jesus' resurrection. So I think for those reasons, it should just be discarded. So the next up is the hallucination theory. And this is probably one of the more popular theories that I've seen. But it claims that in the midst of their grief, the disciples and the other followers of Jesus experienced hallucinations in which they saw Jesus raised from the dead. These were private in some cases, but corporate in others. In these corporate hallucinations, Jesus imparted the same information to everyone having the same experience. Now, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary definition of hallucination is, and you can look this up, it's 1A, perception of object with no reality, usually arising from disorder of the nervous system or in response to drugs, as LSD. B, the object so perceived. 2, definition 2, an unfounded or mistaken impression or notion. Delusion, in other words. So clearly the object and source of hallucinations are not external to the mind. The mind is not witnessing a strange event in the real world that it didn't struggles to interpret. Rather, hallucinations are entirely internal events created by the mind. The possibility of several different people having the exact same hallucination in the exact same way at the exact same time is extremely unlikely, let alone 12 or 500 people at once. So, like the twin theory, it also has the problem with the empty tomb. If the followers of Jesus were just experiencing hallucinations, then the body would have still been in the tomb. So all that would have been required to end Christianity would be to produce the body. Yet the earliest accounts we have all maintain that the tomb was empty. So there's no reason to take the hallucination theory seriously, I don't think. Now we come to the wrong tomb theory. And this states that Jesus' followers discovered the tomb empty because they were at the wrong tomb. But this theory has a number of problems. So first, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were at the burial of Jesus. So they would have known which tomb to go to. And then second, as if they needed a landmark, Pilate placed a number of Roman soldiers outside the tomb to prevent the body from being stolen. So you got them there. Thirdly, like I already mentioned, the oldest argument against the resurrection is that the tomb was empty, which presumes the correct tomb was visited. Also, there's just no evidence for this, and I don't think it should be believed. Now we come to the alien theory. This is real. I mean, it's not real, but you know what I mean. The theory is real. This is the idea that Jesus was an alien from another planet. Okay? So according to this view, because he was from another planet, he was highly advanced in knowledge of medicine and science. He also had psychic abilities. And things that were natural to him would be considered miraculous to people in the first century. And this would explain that he could heal himself in the tomb. He could exit the tomb unnoticed. He was able to find the disciples telepathically and transport himself, in their presence. And there are different takes on how this works, but that's the general idea. Now, the problem with this is that it proves too much. Any objection offered against the theory would just be easily dismissed by invoking Jesus' alien nature. The nature also is presumed to include abilities that look supernatural to humans, and they're efficient for Jesus to pull off this charade. The result is there's no way to prove this theory right or wrong. There's no test that can be performed to determine the truth of this claim. And so a philosopher would probably just dismiss this type of argument as unfalsifiable. But another weakness is that instead of weighing the evidence and being led to this conclusion, adherents typically start with this conclusion and try to confirm the facts to the theory in a favorable way. And this is also a fallacy known as confirmation bias. So this leaves us with an argument that proves so much that it actually proves nothing. So yeah, I think this should just be dismissed. Then we come to what's probably the most popular theory, at least in the academic world. I know in the non-academic world, uh, the hallucination theory is definitely the most popular. Like if you see anybody online and they have alternate theories of the resurrection, that's typically what their belief is that they hallucinated, or something like that. But this is different. This is the legend theory, and it's probably the most popular non-resurrection theory, at least among people who sort of know what they're talking about. It says that Jesus was never taken down, and he was just left to be rot, and be eaten by birds, and that his body was thrown into a common grave and it was eaten by the dogs. Okay. Months later, Peter and the other apostles realized that what happened to Jesus' body was irrelevant. They could still carry on the ministry of Jesus and spread his teaching, no matter if he was properly buried or rotted away and left for carry on. This way, the apostles considered Jesus to still be alive and present in the world. The epiphany that they could carry on Jesus' ministry is what came to be known as the resurrection. Because these things were difficult to convey, especially by uneducated men to an uneducated audience, the apostles did what Jesus did. They spoke in parables and symbols. Therefore, everything recorded in the Gospels about the burial and resurrection of Jesus was just a fiction invented by his followers to convey greater spiritual truths and to vindicate their beloved slain leader. Okay, first problem with this is it does not account for the claim of the Jews that Jesus' body was stolen. Again, the first century claim presupposes that Jesus was buried and that the tomb was found empty. But this legend theory ignores both of these evidences. The second problem with the legend is that this legendary story is full of historical details that could be investigated by anyone that was interested, and it was also proclaimed publicly in the very city where these events took place to people who were quite likely witnesses of at least some part of the story. If the apostles put a spin on their story or invented elements of what they preached, there were plenty of people in a position to either correct or refute them. Public memory of the execution of someone who caused such commotion and on whom such high hopes were hung would not fade away so quickly. If it was truly the plan to spread a legendary tale, then why do it in the place where it could easily be proven wrong? It would have been much more sensible to begin the ministry in Galilee, or really somewhere else remote, maybe not even in Israel, that wasn't full of witnesses. Third, if one were to invent a legendary account that was to be taken as actual history, one would include the most reliable witnesses of the event. So the account would exclude as much as suspicion as possible. But that's not the case with the resurrection of Jesus. One of the most difficult and puzzling elements in this account, if it's a legend, is the discovery of the tomb by women. In first century Palestine, women were considered untrustworthy and were not even allowed to testify in court except under, extreme circumstances. According to Josephus, he says, quote, "Put not trust in a single witness. Let there be 3 or at least 2 whose evidence shall be accredited by their past lives. From women let no evidence be accepted because of the levity and temerity of their sex." In other words, you can't trust women, is what Josephus is saying. I'm not saying that. That's just the idea Josephus had. It was common among first century Jews. So if the legend was to be convincing, why would the apostles have the empty tomb discovery rest on witnesses whose testimony would be highly suspect and perhaps just dismissed out of hand? Why not skip it and rely on the discovery of respected men who were known to be trustworthy, like Peter and John? Many advocates of this belief say that there is a discernible development of legend in the Gospels, and one is found in the account of Joseph of Arimathea. And this is important because if there was no Joseph, then there was no acquisition of Jesus' body, so there's no tomb to be buried in, no tomb to be found empty, and no resurrection. And I'm not going to read all of the passages. You can look them up on your own. It's Mark 15, 14 through 46, Matthew 27, 57 through 60, Luke 23, 50 through 53, John 19, 38 through 42. Those are the passages where Joseph is mentioned. But assuming Mark was written before Matthew, we see that Joseph was a part of the Sanhedrin and therefore implicated in Jesus' death. Matthew adds that he was the disciple of Jesus. Luke adds that he was a good man and did not agree with the Sanhedrin's verdict. And John adds that he feared the Jews and was in hiding. The development of legend is also said to be in the descriptions of the tomb, the burial shroud, and the stone from the tomb. Mark says Joseph had a tomb. Matthew says the tomb was new. Luke says that it had never been used. John says that it was in a garden. Mark says the burial cloth was fine linen. Matthew says the linen was clean. Luke says the same thing Mark says. John says the cloth was accompanied by spices. Mark says a stone was rolled against the tomb. Matthew says the stone was, quote, a great stone. So to the proponents of this theory, these passages provide justification for believing that a legend had developed and the resurrection has no historical basis. But this is counterintuitive, and counterintuitive interpretation of the facts. Excuse me. So just because Mark says a stone was rolled in front of the tomb and Matthew calls it a great stone is no cause to dismiss the account as legend, I don't think. Also, the description of the burial shroud as linen, fine linen, or clean linen is not contradictory, nor does it indicate, development of legend. The absence of the detail from the Synoptic Gospels that the tomb was in a garden is no reason to suspect John invented it. That Joseph was a member of the council and feared the council's reprisals, since he was a follower of Jesus, so he went into hiding, seems the most obvious reading of the text. So the details, they don't contradict. Rather, it seems far more likely the details are coming from different accounts of the same event and thus have a corroborative and complementary quality. But imagine if all the accounts were identical. You could imagine that the argument, is that they conspired to invent the story. The claim that Joseph is legendary can just be dismissed for a lack of evidence. Other details of the burial of Jesus can be dismissed in a similar fashion as well, I think. Now, there's another thing, though. Were there 1, 2, or 3 women who discovered the tomb? Was there one angel or 2 angels? Was Jesus recognizable at the tomb in his appearance or not? Some scholars see these as diverse accounts, basically the making of a legend. But I think I've already shown that this argumentation is not the best reading. I think the better explanation is that they're complementary and corroborative. after this reading, bring with it the problem of the empty tomb and the discovery of the empty tomb by women. A variation of the legend theory basically has enthusiastic followers of Jesus, other than apostles, begin to tell exaggerated tales of his deeds that develop over the years into the story that we know now. But there are three major flaws with this. The ever-present problem of the empty tomb being attested to very early on by enemies of Christianity. The behavior of the apostles. The apostles would have corrected errors in the false teaching about Jesus. This is why some of the New Testament books were written, actually, was to combat false teaching about Jesus. Finally, legend theorists reject the idea that the apostles claimed Jesus was resurrected in bodily form. Marcus Borg says, quote, "Are we to think of these stories as reporting the kinds of events that anybody could have witnesses if they had been there, or could have witnessed if they had been there? That is, video cam kinds of events." Well, this is directly answered in Luke 1 verses 1 through 4, where he says that he's reporting eyewitness accounts. Paul defended what must have been similar messed up there. But I was saying that Paul was defending the idea of a bodily resurrection. If we look at 1 Timothy 4:7, it says, "But have nothing to do with pointless and silly myths, rather train yourself for godliness." Okay. And 1 Timothy 1:3 says, "As I urged you when I went to Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain people not to teach false doctrine." So, Paul seems to be against the idea that they would just endorse all these legends. N.T. Wright says, quote, "Paul not only believed that Jesus had been bodily raised from the dead, he believed he knew how it was done, both in the sense of where the power came from, the Spirit of the Creator God, and in the sense that he knew what the difference was, corruptibility and non-corruptibility, between the body which died on the cross and the body that rose." The understanding of the apostles had of the resurrection came from the Pharisees. And the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the physical body to an incorruptible state at the end of time. The apostles' claim of Jesus' resurrection differed with their expectation only in the point of timing. They did not expect the resurrection, days after his death. But they did recognize what they experienced as a physical bodily resurrection. Okay, so that deals with the legend theory. Now we go to the Quran. What does the Quran say about this? So the New Testament is not the only sacred book that has an account of resurrection. The Quran, which is Islam's holy book, tells of the arrest, crucifixion, and resurrection, but it differs from the biblical account big time. So in Surah 4, 157 to 158, it says, quote, "And for saying, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God. They never killed him. They never crucified him. They were made to think that they did. All factions are full of doubt concerning this issue. They possess no knowledge. They only conjecture. For certain, they never killed him. Instead, God raised him to him. God is Almighty, most wise." End quote. Islam teaches Jesus never died but was taken into heaven. And there are a couple ways of explaining this. One says that the soul of Jesus departed from his body before the torture and execution. According to the footnote in the authorized English version of the Quran, it says, quote, "His enemies tortured and crucified his living but empty body." So Jesus was assumed into heaven, but his soulless body was led on the earth to be tortured. Another more popular tradition says that Judas, unbeknownst to the disciples, went to Jesus' prison and took Jesus' place, allowing Jesus to escape. And then God then made Judas to look and sound like Jesus. The executioner thought they crucified Jesus when he was really in hiding. 3 days later, he appeared to his followers, passing himself off as being resurrected. And this view is based on the Gospel of Barnabas, which gives a similar account in verses 2:16 to 2:19. Now, there are a number of problems with this account. So first, the Quran dates from the 7th century. So the account is almost 600 years removed from the events it claims to correctly document. Compare that with the New Testament that makes claims of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection of the third day, and resurrection sightings that date back within 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion. Given the choice between believing an account 1 to 3 years removed that is repeatedly confirmed by eyewitnesses and an account 700 years removed from the event that has no corroboration, the burden is placed on the latter. We have already seen that we don't need to take the claims of the Quran or Muhammad seriously, I don't think. Muhammad was not in a position to speak with authority against the New Testament. And if he was in that position, he was not able to demonstrate his prophetic office in a way consistent with how God authenticated every previous prophet in history. But either way, the Quranic account can be dismissed. Also, the Gospel of Barnabas is a very poor source to cite in corroboration of the Quranic accounts, since it's an apocryphal document that was written as late as the Middle Ages. It was written too late to be included in the canon, but it is also removed from the crucifixion up to twice the amount of time as the Quran. It also suffers for being the only source besides the Quran making such a claim, as opposed to the 27 books of the New Testament, all which date within the 1st century, and not counting the multitude of writings by the early church fathers, as well as non-Christian 1st century sources such as Josephus. Also, according to the Gospel of Barnabas, the body laid in the tomb was stolen by Jesus' disciples, and this objection does not stand. It would also mean Jesus was nothing more than a fraud, a conclusion that's inconsistent with his character. Again, the behavior of the disciples argues against this possibility of a scenario, I believe. So then now we're going to look at the biblical account of the resurrection. So the resurrection is the claim that on the third day, after Jesus was crucified and buried, he was resurrected from the dead by the power of God for the purpose of testifying to Jesus' authority to say and do the things he did. There's a lot of support for this, some of which I've already mentioned, like the empty tomb being attested by very early and hostile sources, this discovery of the tomb by witnesses whose testimony was not allowed in court, the testimony of the Gospels, which are eyewitness accounts, and the radical change in the disciples after that Sunday. In addition to this, we must add the conversion of Saul of Tarsus to the Apostle Paul. Saul was a Jew trained in religious studies by the most respected of Pharisees, as well as learned in Greek culture and language, as well as being a Roman citizen. This was a privileged as well as an uncommon combination. According to his own account, he was extremely devoted to the religion of the Jews and specifically to the tradition of the Pharisees. So devoted was he that he persecuted the early Christians, who were, in his mind, heretics that were worthy of prison and death. On one such persecution mission, Paul was on the road to Damascus, when he was thrown to the ground in the face of a brilliant heavenly light, and a voice asked him, "Saul, Saul, Why are ye persecuting me?" Paul asked who it was that spoke. The voice replied, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Jesus then explained that he was appointing Paul to the purpose of preaching to the Gentiles. Those with Paul heard a sound, but they could not discern a voice and they didn't see anything. From that moment on, Paul became the most industrious, tenacious, and fearless of all Christian evangelists. He almost had no concern for his personal well-being. He was beaten, jailed, flogged, and shipwrecked on numerous occasions. He forfeited his position of privilege and wealth, which he probably had, as a student of Gamaliel. So the heretic hunter became the hunted heretic. Ultimately, his preaching that Jesus had been resurrected physically from the dead, in keeping with the messianic prophecies made in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, cost him his life. He was beheaded in Rome by Nero somewhere in the late 60s AD. So several things are clear from this account. Paul was predisposed to not believe in Jesus, okay? Paul was not converted to a belief that if he just believed in Jesus' teachings, that it would be like Jesus came from the dead. Paul was not converted by hallucination, since those with him could testify to Paul's state of mind. The light that appeared and the sound, they could not discern from the light. I think I said earlier that they couldn't see anything. It actually doesn't say that. It says they couldn't see a person. So they probably saw the light, but they couldn't see Jesus, actually. But Paul could, apparently. But hallucinations are internal to the mind. They're not, externally verifiable like this event. And if the tomb had not been empty, someone as devoted to defeating Christianity as Paul would have had Jesus' tomb opened to expose the body and crush the movement. In addition, the apostles did not believe Paul's conversion. Paul had to really work to gain their trust. When Paul did meet the apostles, they approved of him and endorsed the message he claimed was personally given to him by Jesus to spread to the Gentile world. And as a Pharisee, Paul believed in a physical, bodily resurrection, not an apparition, hallucination, or fanatical remembrance of someone's life. The best explanation for Paul's embracing the very thing he hated most in the world is that he had a real historical encounter with the resurrected Jesus. Only this could explain a radical conversion in such a passionate person. Finally, we have to consider Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. This is most likely the oldest part of the New Testament because it's a creed that Paul says he received after his conversion. And this means it existed before his conversion. It is widely held by scholars of all different stripes that Paul's conversion happened around 3 years after the crucifixion. This means that the creed came into existence no later than 3 years after the crucifixion. And it's in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8, which says, "For I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "then to the 12, then he appeared to over 500 brothers and sisters at one time. Most of them are still alive, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he appeared also to me." So in this ancient creed, we see the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was buried, rose on the third day, in fulfillment of messianic prophecies in the Tanakh, and then appeared to numerous people, most of whom, according to Paul, were still alive at the time of that writing. The information about Jesus' appearances in his resurrected state infers these people could be questioned. There's no doubt that the earliest Christians believed Jesus died and was resurrected in bodily form. And this remains the best explanation for the events. N.T. Wright says, the truly extraordinary thing is that this belief was held by a tiny group who, for the first 2 or 3 generations at least, could hardly have mounted a riot in a village, let alone a revolution in an empire. And yet they persisted against all odds, attracting the unwelcome notice of the authorities because of the power of the message and the worldview and lifestyle it generated and sustained. And whenever we go back to the key text for evidence of why they persisted in such an improbable and dangerous belief, the answer is because Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. So now we get to the end, and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, admittedly, taken in isolation, is difficult to accept. I'll grant that. However, to investigate the resurrection in isolation is to discount not just a large amount of information that contributes to what we know or what we can know about the event, but it also discounts the resurrection context entirely. Previously I've given good reasons to think that the God of the Bible exists, that He's communicated with humanity very specifically, and He is involved in our world. And because we've seen that miracles are possible, the claim of Jesus' resurrection cannot be dismissed out of hand. Because the resurrection, the time of its occurrence, and the person being resurrected were foretold, it becomes both more difficult to construct alternate explanations and provides more criteria that a claim of resurrection must meet. When the events of the Sunday after the crucifixion are studied in context, the resurrection alone makes sense of the facts, and it falls prey to none of the objections. As a result, the resurrection has real meaning because it's the event that authenticates Jesus as someone who spoke the words of God. So his teaching is divinely authoritative. But that, makes us ask the question, what did he teach? Jesus' moral and ethical teachings are revered not just by Christians, but also by many people who are in other religions and even by some atheists. However, Jesus also taught about who he was and what he was here for. He taught about himself, his identity, his nature. So the big question is, did Jesus claim to be God? Well, that's what we're gonna look at next time. So, so I think I hope I've been able to demonstrate that the resurrection of Jesus, the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, it's what has the best, what we would call explanatory scope. So it explains all the facts. All of the other theories, they can't explain all the facts, but the resurrection can. Now, you're either one of two people. You are open to the supernatural or you're not. Let me say that again. I'm not saying you start from a basis of believing the supernatural. You're just open to it. Maybe it can happen. Maybe it can happen. Or you're not. You're what you call, a naturalist, a philosophical naturalist, which is only the things that are physical and empirical. Only those things can be known and are real. Well, if you're a naturalist, not only will you not accept the resurrection, you actually can't. Because a resurrection can't occur. Not like Jesus' resurrection. That can occur on a naturalist worldview. However, if you're open to the idea that God exists and that, he possibly could act in the world, if you examine the resurrection account, then it's the one that makes the most sense, and you can accept it. You're at the point where your worldview allows you to accept it. So I would just keep that in mind to try to just be open to different things, even if you come from a more maybe atheist agnostic background. I certainly wouldn't just discount these things. I would try to actually take them seriously, because I think it is serious. It is serious. But yeah, so next time we're going to be talking about the claim of Christ, or did he even claim that? Because some people say that Jesus didn't claim to be God. That if you think he's God, that you're stepping over some bounds, because Jesus never said he was, and that was something invented, at the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea, they invented that Jesus was God. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that that's what happened. Yeah, right. Only if you took, Fake History 101. Yeah, so the Fake History 101 class, that's true. Nicaea did invent Jesus as God. That's true. But if you take a real history class in Christianity, you'll see that, no, actually, Jesus claimed to be God, and he actually demonstrated that he was. So yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about. Jesus' claim to be God. We're also going to talk about something else that's also key. And this is probably, if I'm willing to bet, or I'm not a betting person, so I don't really bet, but if I were going to bet on the most hated doctrine in Christianity, at least in modern times, it's got to be that Jesus is the only way. And we're going to talk about that too. Jesus being the only way. That's probably the most despised Christian doctrine of all time. It's called the exclusivity of Christ. You must have Christ. Yeah. That's probably, yeah. That's a doctrine that's hard to make in today's climate. We live in a very, multicultural, pluralistic, world. Something also to mention is people say, well, you have to respect other people's beliefs and ideas. No, you don't. You have to respect their right to hold those beliefs and ideas. But you don't have to respect those beliefs and ideas. That's just something to keep in mind. People talk about tolerance. It's funny because, to me, I feel like the people who talk about tolerance the most are the least tolerant. Because every time somebody like me comes along, they're like, ugh, like, what's your problem? And I was like, well, I thought I'd say you were tolerant. And they're like, yeah, well, except you. Or, no, I'm not just me personally, but kind of people who think similar to me. Lean to more conservative outlook on things and stuff like that. Which, I'm not talking about the politicians, by the way. I'm not talking about conservative politicians. I'm talking about the principles and the ideas and stuff. That's why I lean that way. It's like, so anyway, but we're not talking about politics right now. We may eventually, but we're not right now. So yeah. So keep in mind about what's coming up next. And I said last video that next time would be the last video in this series. It's actually not. There's one more, because there's this one objection to everything I've talked about. There's like this one objection that people use. And I want to deal with that one objection, because there's a lot of different ones, but I really don't think that they're low-hanging fruit. So I want to get to the main thing and I will get to the main thing video after next. So it'll be next video, then the next video is the last one. Then we get on stuff that I really, really, really do want to do. Okay. So yeah. So I will see y'all next time, and God bless.